This is the Court Leader's Advantage, a podcast series for court professionals and by court professionals. Brought to you by thecourtleader.net and in cooperation with NACM, the National Association for Court Management. Leaders deal with multiple circles of individuals. Two that you, as a court administrator or clerk of court, deal with are those who report to you and those that you either report to or deal with as a fellow stakeholder. Those reporting to you include your team, typically 5 to 7 people, and the larger office or court staff. The next circle centers on your presiding judge and your bench. It includes your funding body, such as the city council, the county board, the state administrative office, or the state legislature. It extends to your fellow justice partners, such as the sheriff, the prosecutor, the bar, and community organization. The leadership skills needed to deal with both circles include team building, mentoring, strategic thinking, organization, persuasive speaking, and concise, effective writing. But you deal with your fellow stakeholders, and principally your judges, differently than you would with your court staff. Your judges are leaders in their own right. Usually they have their own vision, which may or may not align with yours. They are well educated and may not even be particularly interested in your counsel. In addition, many judges may have developed their own concepts on managing people. They're used to handing down orders from the bench, having them obeyed. Many are elected, so they have their own specific constituency. And court staff often have a direct informal pipeline to individual judges. Rick Pierce described the role of the administrator dealing with this circle as being one of an influencer. I'm Pete Kiefer, and welcome to the Court Leader's Advantage podcast series. This month, we're looking at the leader as an influencer of others in power. What is the environment really like? Are there different skills necessary, or just different ways of applying the skills you already have? And what is your mindset when working with your bench? Here to discuss these questions are Rick Pierce, Judicial Programs Administrator for the Pennsylvania Administrative Office of the Courts; Melinda Brooks, Grants and Special Projects Manager for the Municipal Court in Franklin County, Ohio; Ellen Procida Fisher, Operations Manager for the Superior Court in Cape May, New Jersey; Joshonda Guerrier, Interim Chief Administrative Officer for the Juvenile Court in Fulton County, Georgia; and Lori Tyak, Clerk of Court for the Municipal Court in Franklin County, Ohio. Thank you all for joining today's podcast. Now, we've all had to work with people who are leaders in their own right, such as your court's bench. Can you describe a time when you took on an influencer role rather than the classic leadership position? How were the circumstances different? Did you change your approach? And if so, how? Melinda Brooks?
When I thought about this question, what came to mind for me was when I was actually in a deputy chief probation officer role. We were in a period of transition in our probation department, and our judges came to me and said that they wanted to start a pretrial program. And there were exactly like 7 seconds to apply for the grant that would fund said pretrial program. And it was all through funding through our State Department of Corrections. And the leadership prior to me had really had some consternation about some of the things that were going on with the Department of Corrections funding stream that required the implementation of a risk assessment process. It was just a period of evolution, right? There were folks who had been working one way in probation for a long time. It was very hard for them to kind of pivot to this next realm. And some of our judges had the same kind of feelings about it. You know, they didn't understand the risk assessment stuff. We had not really done a lot of evidence-based practices training. So I saw it as an opportunity to kind of bring us into that next evolution, if you will, of community supervision. So during the pendency of my interim time, kind of covering both roles, and then ultimately as deputy chief, we worked hard to locate funding for some very high level strategic planning technical assistance. We engaged our stakeholders for just understanding the concept of pivoting from like plea-based agreements deciding conditions of probation and levels of probation to those decisions not coming from the bench, but rather coming from the assessment process in the probation department. So it was a great pivot. It was a large ship to turn, is what we kept saying. And Clerk Tyek probably had been a part of some of those meetings too, where we had to really invest the time and the energy and help the judges feel comfortable that if they were to release that control to the probation department, that it would not be releasing total control of their case. For one, they would still be in charge, obviously, of the case, but that we could be trusted with those decisions on how intensively or not intensively to supervise those folks.
Did you try any unique approaches compared to how you might deal with your office staff?
We found a couple of judicial champions that really were invested in it and worked very closely with them and made sure they had the support they needed should they receive some, feedback or questions from some of their colleagues, either on the bench or among higher level stakeholders.
Rick Pierce?
Thank you, Peter. I will say that I think it's important for everyone who is listening to this podcast and viewing it. So go back to the beginning where you described the influencer and the people that you need as a court administrator that you need to influence, and that how that varies dependent upon not only the scenario, but who you're talking to. I really think it's important at the outset to know that we as administrators really need to be focused on using relational power, knowing our audience, knowing them as well as we possibly can, knowing our position with that audience, and using it as a building of trust and developing the mutual interest and the mutual want, as opposed to coercive power. Because with very few exceptions, administrators are not going to be able the ones to be using coercive power. If anything, that's going to fall from the decision makers, i.e. in our instance, namely judges. I think that with that said, I am usually in that position of influencing. I think the approach of influencing, it really does depend upon the circumstance and the situation. In some instances, I can say, well, data did weigh heavily in the decision, and it usually does. But in particular, when working here at the AOC, I think data is more prevalent, more of a demand for it. But I do say that with some decisions, with some decision makers, data can actually be a turnoff. That person may be more concerned with the personal impact on the employee or the court user. Judges, in my experience, do like the data because they can see, and if they can see, if they can comprehend what they're reading, they realize the impact. But my experience has also been to say that judges may place even greater emphasis on other criteria, such as the visible impact on a court user or a court employee. And when they witness that impact of a policy or procedure upon court users or court stakeholders, it's not only seen, but it's felt. And that is a powerful tool of persuasion. I think sometimes being an influencer means being a change agent too. And as administrators, we really should be that agent of change. But unfortunately, not all decision makers are change agents. And oftentimes judges who make decisions based upon precedent are inherently resistant to change, even in administrative matters, because that's been their background. But I will say that I think that this teaches you to balance your role and understanding your limits of authority, whether you're working directly with judges or those that are in leadership or senior executives at an AOC who do respond differently than judges do.
Lori Tyek?
Thank you, Peter. I think influencing others, one of the ways that I do it is I try to help others believe that the impossible may be possible. And that sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but sometimes when people think, oh, that can't be so, we can't do it that way, they have to think about it a little bit. I have to plant the seed, the idea in their minds. And then whenever they're ready, they'll come back and circle around and talk about it with me. And then we can start working on it together. One of the things in Columbus that happened just before the pandemic was a realization that Columbus has one of the highest numbers of evictions in Ohio. And the city of Columbus created a Columbus Women's Commission that focused on ideas and ways to help people in the community who are at high risk for losing their homes, losing jobs because of home issues. So they determined that women with young children were the most likely to be evicted and to most have the longest history for eviction. So one of the things that we did based on the Women's Commission suggestions was we took a look at how long our eviction history is online, what that history is on our online services. And we limited it to 3 years. So you can come to our office and see those documents or those records that date back to the beginning of time, or you can take those 3 years from the website and work with those. The exciting thing is we did that just based on an idea of how long those cases are kept in our file room. So once they're closed, they're kept for 3 years before they can be destroyed. And so we named the 3 years as our target number. Other communities in Ohio started doing the same thing. Dayton, Akron, Hamilton County recently also took all of their online history back to 3 years for evictions. And I think it's made a difference for those people that are higher risk for continued eviction issues that may not be under their control.
What kind of skills and abilities are necessary to be an effective influencer? And are these skills different from those of the classic leadership skills, such as team building, mentoring, and organization? Ellen Presida Fisher.
Thank you, Peter. So for me, one, and I'll get to this, I guess, I don't know that I think they are different. For me, the primary skill is active and attentive listening. I think that is at the heart of building relationships that are authentic, which Melinda spoke about, Rick, when they talked about trust being at the core of those things. Effective influencing happens organically as a result of that. You know, when we engage in conversations and in relationships where we truly want to know the other person's needs, what are their preferences, what are their objectives, where they need to get to, not simply so that we can influence them later, but because we genuinely care and we want to add value or provide value, then I think it happens again organically. And that, you know, when they talked about the mutual trust, it's a two-way street, but I think it begins with us, right? So if we are prepared with an open mind and an open ear, I think that the other person, when we're in a position where we need to advocate for a program where there could potentially be some resistance, that they're at least open to the conversation. I don't know that I see influencing as convincing someone that my perspective is the right one. What I hope is just that I plant a seed or ask them to consider it as a possibility. But I have to be prepared to do the same thing when they're asking that of me. And again, I don't know. I think that authenticity, open listening, I think that's at the core of people skills. Of course, leadership is there, whether it's team building or mentoring, even strategic planning. If we're not listening to each other, we're not going to come up with a solid plan that's going to take us into the future.
Joshanda Guerrier.
So the skills and abilities that come to mind when I think about being a positive influencer are those of listening, reframing, redirection, and motivation. You really have to be able to listen for understanding to assess the motivating factor or intent of the individuals or entities with whom you are attempting to have influence over. Being an influencer is a high-stakes role that requires ethics and a great deal of business savvy. We all have influence in one manner or another, but the question really becomes whether we choose to influence people with whom we interact to improve outcomes for our services or to enhance the client experiences for our customers, or to simply have influence for power alone. Hopefully in our roles as court administrators, we are choosing to use our influence to enhance and strengthen the services provided by our courts while positively impacting the professional trajectory of our team members, which in turn should influence the public's perception of the work that we do as a whole. From a classic leadership standpoint, I would agree that many of the foundational skills are similar. However, when some people think about traditional leadership, they may contemplate the various prescriptive, manualized leadership techniques that many of us have been taught. But in comparison, when I think about an influencer, I really reflect upon their position as perceived expert, all-knowing, very highly regarded in some ways, awed by many. People trust the influencer's opinion and follow him and her, even sometimes before having had the pleasure of knowing them. The reality is, whether we are an influencer, a classic leader, or manager, director, administrator, simply trying to accomplish work through others, we are change agents tasked with creating positive, ethical, supportive work environments for the people entrusted to us to lead. Cultivated correctly, such an environment should allow our staff to perform quality work, deliver stellar customer service, and engage meaningful, productive relationships with our partners, our community stakeholders, and our funders at large.
Melinda?
I want to kind of chime back to what Rick mentioned in terms of the notion of trust. So I've been with the court for 27 years. I was looking over the list of our judges and I realized I think only one of them was here when I first started. Everybody else has come in still over many years, but some of them were attorneys standing beside me in revocation hearings for when I was a probation officer. They've been with prosecutor's office. So I have a rapport on a personal, professional level with many of them. But my current role also just has me more in like project management type of function with them. So, while we have the decorum still, of course, on the court level, my approach in terms of influence and leadership have evolved with time, right? That with growth, myself as a professional. And so, and some judges have a very direct rapport with some staff. I'm helping out right now with specialized dockets. So those teams are very tight knit with their judges. So it's a little bit of a balance between assisting as a manager, recognizing that tight relationship, and not overstepping boundaries, obviously, because I'm helping out as an interim role there too. So I've learned to identify and recognize the judge's specific interests, things that they're passionate about, so that when I'm addressing them and assisting with those projects, I can really be of use in terms of my grant work and project management, and then also, helping the staff come along with the changes that those projects bring.
Can you describe a time when you either advocated for a project or effort and the court decided against moving forward, or on the flip side, warned against the direction and the court decided to move forward anyway? How did you deal with it? Did your team know your position? And did you have to deal with any fallout? Rick?
I will tell you that my experiences with the AOC are very different than working in a trial court. So maybe I won't tell a story about what happened here at AOC, but I will say that the AOCs, for the most part, we are pretty much on the same page. Sometimes it boils down to details that may differ, and how does that affect a project? And how do I get by there as an influencer? And sometimes it's a little bit more difficult because we have the initial buy-in, but some of the details may differ on my suggestions than what ultimately is decided. But I will tell you a story that I had in my experiences in my trial court. And this was a situation where I was bringing in the entire bench to talk about developing a strategic plan, something that they had never done before. And now they had known me, so we did have a great deal of trust, and they knew that I was not going to send them down a road they didn't necessarily want to go, but obviously that they were also going to be the final decision maker. So I was trying to actually encourage them to proceed with a differentiated case management and more of a controlled court environment, in the sense that we would take control of the case management system, as opposed to having an attorney driven. It would be court controlled or court driven. This met with some resistance. There was some judges that were in favor of it, but most who were, obviously members of the bar and had close ties with the bar association in the jurisdiction, were not in favor of it. In fact, the president judge, or we call them president judges, they're presiding judges in other judicial districts or in other states, said, Richard, do you want to be the court administrator of the year? And of course, the other judges were appalled that he said that. They're like, he's just joking. He's just joking. I said, no, it's okay. I'm okay with it. I have a relationship with all of you. I'm okay to take these kinds of things. And we all kind of laughed about it, but I also knew that it was dead in the water. And so I did have to backpedal and say, okay, you know, when I would approach one of these other judges about an idea, this judge, who was a fantastic judge, who I had a really good relationship with, when he was the president judge, I could always tell when he did not agree with me. He'd say, now that's interesting, Rick, that's really interesting. And so I knew, okay, it's time to stop. Don't push, you know. And when he used the word interesting, I knew that, okay, maybe this is his way of saying, I'm really not interested. I'm glad you are, but we're going my way. And so I would stop and go a different direction. But I will say this, I was really fortunate, perhaps really blessed, to work with judges with whom I agreed on all things operation and on their ethical decisions for probably 98 to 99% of the decisions that we had to make during my 13 years in my court. I really, as I mentioned earlier, I think once a level of trust was established, which really took place early on, we knew what we wanted for the court. We had divergent interests between me and the bench at many times, and maybe even among the judges. There were divergent interests and many divergent paths on how to attain our mutual interests. But we made it work because of trust. And I think trust from a moral, value-based character, as well as a trust that each one of us was competent to carry the task to completion at the highest level of the benefit for the court and the community.
Lori?
I agree a lot with what Rick had to say. Bringing new ideas to the table can be part of influencing others. And we had a situation where during the pandemic, our court building shut down, but the court moved traffic court or traffic violations court hearings and eviction hearings down to the Columbus Convention Center so that we could spread out, be a little bit more safe with our environment. I did bring up the idea of doing electronic workflow and having more of an electronic or paperless environment down at the Columbus Convention Center. The traffic hearings would have been significantly reduced from 300 per day, 5 days a week, to about 100 or so per day. Magistrates and judges at this moment are still comfortable with using the paper and making rulings based on what's in the paper file, and they don't use the computer system all that often. And so there was a lot of resistance to my idea, even though I mentioned it would be a hardship for the clerk's office to daily transfer and transport all of those case files to and from the convention center. It's maybe a mile and a half from here, but still just being responsible for those paper files was a little bit nerve-wracking. At that time, the court was not willing to consider it. I think it would have been an opportune time, and I did my best to influence them to even try it. It was a resounding no. It's still a resounding no, but we are moving forward with receiving electronic citations from law enforcement, and we're trying to show the court there's no need to continue to print all the documents that belong in these files when we're receiving everything electronically on the front end. It's making more work for us. It's harder to keep up. It's just something that I'm going to continue to advocate for, even though it was a resounding no about 4 years ago. So I'm not going to give up. And I think that's part of being an influencer. When you really believe in something, you don't give up.
Ellen?
Well, to Lori's point, change is hard, right? Change is hard for all of us. So when I thought about this question, initially I struggled. I called my court administrator and I said, either I haven't supplied enough ideas to not have one rejected, which, or I can't remember one. And I think for me, so I'm very fortunate, Peter, in the New Jersey court, it's very open and inclusive as far as thoughts and ideas coming from all levels of staff, including managers. And it is a collaborative environment. So you feel like you can go to folks, you can talk with stakeholders. What do you think about this before you take it to those that are going to make the decision? During COVID, and I feel like this was a bit of a positive, we were in a place where we didn't have a playbook. And we really had to be able to put everything out there without fear of fallout. I thought that was an interesting part of your question. If people fear fallout simply by advocating for something, as long as they're doing it respectfully, checking their own ego, will they then continue to do that? I'm not sure. But in particular during COVID, we had digital access, obviously, was a real concern across the country. And we had split the rooms between two of our primary users, family division and civil division. So 50%, 50%. After a few months and looking at the numbers, civil appeared to be using them about 80% of the time, and family only needed them about 20. Which then said, well, it probably makes sense then to allocate more space. Knowing this would impact the family division more so, right? There'll be a concern likely. I contacted that stakeholder first and says, this is what I'm thinking. Now, I've worked with this person for 27 years. So it goes back to that trust again. And we spoke through it. Obviously, all the conversation's always about it being mission driven. And then we brought the other manager in to say, okay, how can we make this work? And you know, you can see the look on people's faces when they have a concern and they're not saying them. So it's, you know, what are your concerns? Well, that I give you the room and I never get it back. So it's like, okay, let's talk through that. Well, maybe we evaluate this every few months. As we start to transition back to in-person hearings, we certainly have done that. You know, going back to the more traditional model. As a result, we did reallocate the space, and it was just better service to our court users in both divisions, and really easier for our staff to provide the quality service that they needed to. So it goes to what everyone else has said. Really, I think trust is at the heart of it. If people trust that your intentions are in the right place, and if it's about court operations, it's about service, then I think people are open to the conversation. I really do.
So what's your best advice to others on how to effectively influence those in leadership? Rick?
Well, Peter, I would like to say, first of all, that at least my comments, I think, have been directed to where I was responding to someone above me in a position of power and influence. But I do think that some of these principles can work with your own staff. But here again, collaborative thinking and consensus building still seems to work. And it actually, what it does is, in some respects, empowers those people who work for you. And I think that actually leads to greater chance of success and greater team chemistry within your office. But to answer your question, I will say always seek a champion for the cause who outranks you. There's always somebody above you, and seek that person out. Having an open mind is another advice that I would give, and approach each and every day as an opportunity to make a difference, even if that means that you're in that role behind the action and not necessarily the decision maker.
Lori?
I think trust, as we've all mentioned, is something that we consider part of influencing, having trust with those that we can influence. But, you know, I think that we need to continuously work on it by keeping all lines of communication open with those individuals that we're working on our relationships with. I think being open to new ideas and new ways of doing business is something. And although the timing may not be right, it's always important to plant the seed, that idea that you can come back to later. And lastly, use your influence to empower others. You don't often have to lead, but you can encourage them in a way to take that lead and to be an influence in their lives.
Ellen?
For me, it comes down to 3 words. Every interaction counts, regardless of who that interaction is with. Those that are above us, our peers, those that report to us. I don't think there is a middle or a neutral here. I think each interaction either adds value to that person, to the relationship, or it detracts from it. That doesn't mean we agree all the time. It simply means that even when we have different perspectives, we are respectful of the other person. We attempt to be understanding of their own perspective. The other piece that I'm adding as part of this conversation is, I think part of influence is when you're going to the person, when you're proposing something, to have your own ducks in a row, right? So instead of just going with the idea, have you looked at it completely? Is it, you know, mission and vision driven? Is it aligned with your core values? What is the objective and what are the potential pitfalls? Have you talked to the stakeholders for what you couldn't consider like unanticipated consequences? And having that full picture, the good, the bad, and the ugly, these are the potential pitfalls before you take it to those that are the decision makers, because going back to what the whole panel said, that builds trust. They know you're going to come to them with a full picture, not only your limited perspective on something.
Melinda?
I'm going to take mine to like my operational practical brain. I feel like it is very easy on a higher level to divorce yourself far enough from the day-to-day functions of the department or the staff or the court. Because we do, as leaders, we have to leave the minutia, right, to staff. But if you get so far away from understanding how the impact of your big ideas, mission-driven projects impact the day-to-day function of line staff, then to go back to kind of what Joshonda said, then they don't feel seen. So kind of what I try to do is help those above me understand the impact of what they're, proposing and working on, and troubleshoot anything that might trickle down, have a negative impact on the line staff that would then erode, the buy-in for the initiative, right? So, it's important to me that, and what I've been really fortunate to have in my current grant role is that I've had a chance to really get to know what all the different divisions of the court do on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like if you're too far away from understanding the day-to-day, then you are at a disadvantage to really fully influencing and supporting initiatives to the leaders above you, whether it be the judges or court administration or stakeholders.
Joshonda?
Yeah, I would say courtesy, sincerity, honesty, and the occasional request to speak freely, ma'am or sir. When dealing with those in power, you almost have to see them as they see themselves and then speak to that. When people feel valued, respected, and heard, your influence is significantly heightened in their ability to trust you, as many of my peer panelists have said today. More often than not, the person in the position of power will hear you if you've taken the necessary steps to establish a trusting relationship. I cannot say it enough. Character is everything. If your interactions with any person, whether it be a person in position of power or not, I will tell you in those interactions, you need to do what you say what you mean, and do them respectfully.
I want to thank Rick Pierce, Melinda Brooks, Joshonda Guerrier, Lori Tyack, and Ellen Procida Fisher for sharing with us their perspectives, their insights, and their advice on the role of a leader as an influencer. Their guidance to us is invaluable. As always, my thanks to you, court professionals, tuning into today's episode. Your influence and inspiration through your words and actions are the basis for the public's trust and confidence in the courts. Thank you. Join us on Tuesday, September 19th for another episode dealing with the issues facing our courts. This has been the Court Leaders Advantage podcast series. I'm Pete Kiefer, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks for joining us today. The Court Leaders Advantage is a regular podcast on courts and court administration. Today's episode will be available on our website, on YouTube, on Facebook, on iTunes, on LinkedIn, and on Twitter. Become part of the conversation. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, email us. Our address is CLApodcast, that's all one word, @nacomnet.org. Did you hear an interesting comment by one of the panelists that you would like to listen to again, but you don't want to search through the entire episode to find it? The additional resources section of the webpage contains a question time marker sheet. Just find the discussion question on the sheet, and next to it is the time that question was asked. You can then quickly fast forward to that time in the episode and listen to the panelists' comments. Remember, if you don't have time to watch an episode, you can always listen to the audio version. Listen in your car or on the bus on your way to or from work. You never have to miss an episode. I'm Pete Kiefer, and on behalf of our guests, the Court Leader website, and the National Association for Court Management, thank you, and have a great day. The views, information, and opinions expressed during this episode are solely those of the host and the individual presenters. They do not necessarily represent the position of the National Association for Court Management.